I'm going to project, so those of you who are in the back of the room, if you can't hear me, just shoot your hand up and I'll speak louder.
Does somebody know? I'm sorry.
You need tech crew?
Yes.
I'll be tech crew.
That would be
Dean.
You know, I'm still in a little shock because I just spoke with your dean and I hadn't realized how involved she had been in providing some of the data that I was working from. I mean, I had come across her work in The Nation and some of her work with Julie Mead and Phi Delta Kappan. But because I relied so heavily in this work on investigative journalism, I was just informed that she was actually very involved in releasing some of these Alec bills and working with the Center for Media Democracy on getting some of this work out. So I had no idea, but it is one of the things I want to emphasize is that, and one of the reasons I did this study is because out of curiosity, I did an exhaustive search of the academic literature on Alec and came up with 0, right? And so I was rather stunned. And this has happened to me before because I was looking at, a few years ago, militarization of high schools and recruitment. I had done some counter-recruiting work in the past, and that was another area where there was very, very little research. I ended up reading mostly investigative journalistic pieces. So it raises some interesting questions about kind of where are the academics in some of these issues, and why are they why do they seem to be sort of off the table for whatever reason? Is it just that we don't have any categories, like what journal do you publish this in, or what SIG and AERA would you go to for this, right? So maybe we need to create some new categories.
I'm just going to push the button for you when you want it.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm in LaGuardia Airport. Oh, and I want to, first of all, thank Erica for the invitation, and also Shirley Wright for doing all the background work to get me here. I don't know if she's in the room. Is that Shirley? Okay, thank you, Shirley. Thank you for not having me transfer planes in Chicago, because it turns out they were all stuck there yesterday. And also the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research for funding the project. So I'm in the LaGuardia Airport in New York. How many of you have ever been at LaGuardia Airport? Right? It's always been sort of this glorified bus station. It's like one of the ugliest airports in the world, right? But they have this new terminal now. How many of you have been in a new terminal, right? Actually, Erica beat me to it. He's been there as well. I thought it was like the day it was opened or something. I've not been in that terminal for whatever reason. I was always in the bus station part. But so I'm there, and my flight was supposed to leave at 1, but it didn't end up leaving until 4:30, so I had a lot of time to kill, and I had a lot of work to do. So I ducked into a restaurant, and I sat at the counter, and I put up my computer, and I started working. And after about 10 minutes, I thought, gee, where's the waiter? You know? And so I called some guy over, and he says, oh, the menu's on the iPad. Yeah. Right? So there's this iPad in front of me. And I thought, oh, okay. So I go into the iPad, and it's dawning on me as I'm going through the menu that not only is the menu on there, but I'm also going to order on there, and I'm also going to pay my bill on there. Mm-hmm. So I'm not only a customer, I'm now the waiter and the cashier. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, boy, this is a good deal for the owner because, you know, they don't have to pay a cashier and they don't have to pay waiters, and all my critical theory background is coming out, and I'm Foucaultian, I'm being constituted as a subject, and the disciplinary power is, you know, raining down on me, and I'm feeling indignant, and my old activist self is saying I should just march right out of here and refuse to be disciplined by this. And I look around the room, and of course everyone in the room is a lot younger than I am, and they're all poking away on their iPads as if there's, you know, like, what's the problem, right? So I ended up, you know, I have ordered online in my apartment at home, but here I am, I'm in the restaurant and I'm ordering online and paying online, right? So anyway, I did it, I ate my meal, I ducked out, went to the sit down and wait for my flight, and my gate had been changed 4 or 5 times, so I was in virtually every part of that airport. And as I tried to find a place to sit, I realized that these iPads were everywhere. You know, like no matter where you sat, there was an iPad there where counters and tables and things. You literally couldn't tell the private space from the public space, right? They had completely blurred. A better way of saying it might be that the private had colonized the public, right? Because no matter where you sat, you had this iPad basically telling you to order something. I didn't want to sit in a restaurant, but I didn't know if I was in the restaurant or not, right? And I tell this story because I had a similar feeling when I started studying Alec and the policy making, the influence that Alec had on policy making. And it dawned on me that not only are our airports being privatized, but our policy making is being privatized. There is a real lack of policy capacity in a lot of state departments of education. People don't have a lot of time. A lot of times the policy folks at state level only meet for 6 or 8 weeks in a year. And so they begin to turn to these private entities to help them with their policy research and their various policy ideas and so forth. And they're open to this kind of input. So it represents a real problem in the sense that there are these groups like Alec that are very equipped to provide that. But it may also represent an opportunity for us if we realize that there are real possibilities for us as academics maybe to have more influence on policy, because we're always complaining that we don't have much influence on policy, right? That most policy is ideological, not based on research. And so this is another, conversation maybe we can have during Q&A is how do we as researchers impact policy? Because we are the ones that are sort of sitting on research, right? Not, this came to the fore when I was on the AIR Council with a couple of your colleagues, Carl Grant and Beth Grau, and we were trying to do this statement, policy statement on value-added testing, and there was a sense that we researchers shouldn't be doing advocacy or making any kind of statement, right? And we were trying to push back on that notion and saying, we're not the ideologues here. We're the ones that are sitting on the data and trying to get our work out there, right? The ideologues are the ones that are having all the influence. So anyway, for those of you who don't know about Alec, which hopefully isn't too many of you, I'll just give a very brief overview. Alec has a number of task forces. I think there's about 9. Alec actually started in 1973 and pretty much flew under the radar for all of those years until just a few years ago when they had some very controversial policies sort of hit the fan, so to speak. Basically what Alec does, which makes it a very unique organization, is it brings legislators together with corporate CEOs to write model or template bills to be passed through state legislatures. Now, we've always known that there's kind of a revolving door in Washington of the private and the public folks. We've always known that the corporations, in some sense, are sitting with legislators to write bills. We know they have big lobbyists in Washington and so on, so this is not necessarily news. But Alec is a fairly unique institution in that it is tax-free because it is able to present itself as an educational organization or a charity organization, and it does have an aspect that is a sort of think tank. It releases an annual report card judging schools by sort of libertarian criteria. It has some publications, but its main core reason for being is to prepare model bills to push through state legislators. And Alec claims a 20% success rate of getting its bills through. This issue of what influence it has is often hard to pin down. A lot of journalists have done some research, probably research we should have been doing, but they've been basically saying, here's the bill that was passed in New Jersey, here was the Alec template bill, how much of the language is the same or similar or whatever. So there's been actually some attempt to actually empirically begin to have some data on the success of their bills. So they are not just a lobbying organization, although they are that. They're actually more than a lobbying organization. The important thing to understand also is that the legislators pay $50 to join Alec, which is a sort of symbolic amount. The corporations pay, I think it's something like $50,000. It varies, I think, depending on the size of the corporation. But what essentially happens, it's kind of like, I don't know if this is still true, but in the old days, when you went to these clubs, the women got in free and the guys had to pay to get in so they'd have access to the women. It's kind of like that. The corporations, pay all this money to get to dance with the legislators, right? Who essentially get in free. It's a membership fee-based organization, and that's important because it means that they're not dependent on foundation money, on so-called soft money, right? They're sustainable through a very strong membership base fee system, which was threatened recently as many corporations began leaving Alec because, what's it been, 2 or 3 years ago, there were 3 big issues. America woke up one day and discovered that something like 30 states had passed laws, stand your ground laws. So when the Trayvon Martin thing surfaced, people began to take a look at these stand your ground laws in various states. The voter ID laws suddenly appeared in all these states. And as you folks in Wisconsin are well aware, a lot of states were passing anti-labor laws around contract, collective bargaining, and so forth. Some journalists began to connect the dots and began pointing to an organization, a little-known organization called Alec. Nobody really heard of Alec. Alec had been very successful at flying under the radar, but suddenly Alec became, if not a household word, at least no longer a sort of secret organization. The pushback on Alec came, and the reason that a lot of organizations, corporations began to pull out was because their task force on elections and safety, one of their 9 task forces, co-chaired by the National Rifle Association, was the task force responsible for the stand your ground laws and the voter ID laws. That's where most of the sort of neoconservatives, as opposed to sort of neoliberal corporate types, were in that task force. Alec closed that task force with the pushback from the corporations. A lot of the better known corporations did not want to be associated with the voter ID laws and the stand your ground laws. The less known corporations, the one that are not household names like Coke and so forth, I think maybe didn't see that anybody would know the difference, and so they stayed in. So that's kind of just a basic overview for those of you that aren't familiar with Alec, and we'll have time in the Q&A if you want to ask more questions. What I want to talk about is the extent to which Alec represents an instance of what we're now sort of calling new governance. And by new governance, I mean these new modalities of governance that are occurring, and I'm going to go into some of these in more detail, from government to governance, and even from a sort of Foucaultian sense to governmentality, which is that way in which we become governed in the way that I was being governed at LaGuardia Airport, right? In which our very subjectivities become changed in the ways we think about what we do. And some of my other work that I'm doing on the new professional, for example, is beginning to show how, as professionals, we are moving from occupational-oriented professionalism in which we as professionals sort of determine, as a professional group, our own sense of ethics and compliance and so on, to a kind of organizational professionalization in which professionals are increasingly not controlled through their own professional organizations, but rather through their work organizations and through the various kinds of compliance that comes from outside the profession, right? And so there's a very subtle shift in how we think about being a professional. New policy actors and entrepreneurs that are on the scene that were not there 20, 30 years ago are having a tremendous influence. And new political and discursive strategies, which was our main focus. Liliana Montoro Doncic was the doc student who worked with me on this. And our main concern here was with these political and discursive strategies. So we didn't actually do a network analysis of Alec. In other words, its place within these larger networks, although we are now working with some other doc students on a study of the State Policy Network, which is a network of state-level think tanks, at least one in every state. The one here in Wisconsin is the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute, I think. And if you go back and look at some of the stuff they were publishing and working on about a year and a half, 2 years before the anti-labor laws came through, you can see that there was a lot of groundwork being laid by that organization, and I'm sure others, around getting that impact through those laws through the local legislature. Next. What I mean by new modalities of governance have to do with these issues like steering from a distance through performance monitoring. So for example, power now operates more directly through steering from a distance. Rather than sort of bureaucratic control, the old-fashioned public bureaucracy, we now have the system steered from a distance through these new high-stakes tests and so forth. So what we used to think of as education organizations as loosely coupled systems are now increasingly tightly coupled systems, and they're tightly coupled through these new technologies of power that operate at a distance. So in other words, the teacher is controlled not by supervisors or inspectors, but rather by these new technologies of power that get behind the classroom door, go directly to the classroom through their requirement to respond and comply to the rigors of testing. The field of educational leadership hasn't quite figured it out yet, but really, leadership becomes more and more irrelevant once the system becomes steered in that way, because the principal's job now becomes one of A, compliance, and B, in a marketized system, public relations. And their sort of educational function becomes really sort of emptied out. Public-private partnerships, in a sense, you could say Alec is a kind of public-private partnership with the corporate and the legislatures internally. New policy networks that are forming, both locally and globally, made up and funded by venture philanthropy. More and more billionaires, because of changes in the tax codes and so forth, with money to spend, with political agendas, influencing not only elections, because we think about corporate influence through Citizens United and more money being put into elections, but what Alec represents is a more subtle form of corporate control in which they're actually sitting with legislators and getting the laws passed through state legislatures. And in education, of course, we spend a lot of time looking at federal level policy, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, et cetera, when in fact, the real action to some extent is happening at the state levels, not necessarily at the federal level. Social entrepreneurs, think tanks. I'm going to run through some of this initial stuff pretty fast because I want to get to the findings. Next. The new policy actors, I don't think I need to run through those. Certainly business associations, not only the National Chamber of Commerce and National Manufacturers Association, but spend about an hour on the Education Industry Association website, and your hair will stand on end. I mean, it's really, this is the for-profit sector's agenda for education. They're the ones that got the vouchers through No Child Left Behind for Kaplan and Sylvan and the tutoring stuff. They wanted to voucherize the whole system, but that's all they got. Political strategies, I won't go into. I'm sure you're familiar with the ways that policies is leveraged through Race to the Top. Murray Edelman's work, who I think is from Wisconsin, he was here at Wisconsin, right, on the political spectacle and the way if you can define something as a crisis, then you can determine the solution, right? Next. Discursive strategies, again, I won't go through this in too much detail, but just to give one example, the Bush administration's effort to replace equal educational opportunity with achievement gap, and that was done systematically through all the language in Washington, which essentially shifts the focus from the notion of resources and opportunity to the notion of outcomes of an achievement gap through, as defined by test scores. So our attention becomes shifted to outcomes away from resources, which is sort of classic new public management, neoliberal kind of strategy. And I think it was Gloria Ladson-Billings here who began to call the achievement gap the opportunity gap, right, as in a way of sort of reclaiming that previous language. Where are we? New modalities. Again, I want to spend just a minute on embedded and ideologically compatible. Oh, well, now I'm getting down to actual Alec. The previous was sort of broad strokes. In Alec's case specifically, the new modalities are this internal public-private partnership with the corporate and public sector. Embedded and ideologically compatible policy networks or strategic alliances. We didn't study those networks in great detail, but what we're doing now with the state policy network, we're finding a lot of linkages globally through the Atlas networks and Liberty networks, which are larger networks of think tanks and new policy entrepreneurs globally, so that you have whole countries like Brazil or India that now have their own version of state policy networks and think tanks throughout the state promoting the same kinds of policies that Alec is promoting. So you can look at, one of my doc students is from Chile, and she's looking at a group called Desarrollo y Libertad, which is Development and Liberty, which is a conservative think tank in Chile, and you can go and look at the kinds of laws they're passing through there and see that they're very similar to the ones in Alec and very similar to the ones in Singapore and very similar to the ones in Hungary and wherever you look. Right? So you're seeing this policy convergence and policy borrowing that's going on globally with a considerable amount of influence through these various, in many cases, corporate-funded entities, and all of those countries have their own variations on the Koch brothers and Bill Gates and so on that are funding many of these organizations. They become a direct conduit for corporations to make policy, part lobbyist, part think tank, part public relations firm. Next. And this is an overview of Alec. Lily and I had trouble with the graphics, but you'd see that Alec is the task force members, and each task force has a public and private director. In education, we'll get to that in a minute, the state legislators and corporate members. And then you have these various venture philanthropists, think tanks. A lot of the state policy networks, think tanks, are connected to Alec, and in fact, there is a very strong relationship between Alec and the state policy network. In fact, I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think when the voter ID thing blew up in Alec's face, they just passed that on to the state policy networks to get it off their books and on to somebody else. But somebody else, just because Alec's got rid of something doesn't mean others aren't then taking that over. And then you have various trade organizations. The National Rifle Association was the co-director of the Elections and Safety Task Force when those laws were passed. The Stand Your Ground law, for example, is a direct result of the National Rifle Association's influence. I realize some of you have to leave for 1:15 classes, so feel free to sneak out when you have to. Next. So this is the actual education task force co-chairs K-12 Inc. and Connections Academy, which I think has changed its name now, but those are basically both technology corporations that, and the primary thing they're pushing through that is, that's okay, is virtual school. So the big education task force policy initiative in Alec, at least, is virtual schools and online education. And the idea behind a lot of the model laws in education is to get states to fund virtual schools at the same rate they're funding brick and mortar schools. That would be their wish list, right? That they would get the same funding and that they wouldn't have to build the gymnasiums and the chemistry labs and all that expensive stuff, but they would essentially get state allocations of funding through virtual schools. So, you know, it looks like you're gonna be seeing a lot around virtual schools in the next few years, and we are already to some extent, particularly in rural areas. So the ALEC task force, they don't just have, they have other laws, which we'll look at in a minute, besides those, but those are the main ones. Venture philanthropists, the state legislators, trade associations, and I can't see this too well, but the for-profit education industry partners for the education task force are, as you might expect, Sylvan Inc. and Kaplan Inc. And Connections Academy and Wireless Generation, Scantron, Dell Inc., K-12 Inc., etc. So corporations, Pearson I imagine is in there somewhere as well. Next, I could spend more time on these, but I want to get to the findings. Good news is that what the visibility of ALEC created were a series of counter networks, right? And I think it's important that we not only be studying ALEC and the state policy networks and so forth, but we also begin to look at the counter networks that are forming, the more progressive networks out there. And in the case of the pushback on ALEC, you had these groups forming. Some of them are older groups. One that I think was formed around, particularly the voter ID laws, was Color of Change, which is an important organization that is still active. Van, what's his name, was one of the... Van Jones, I think, was one of the people who started that. But the NAACP and, Urban League and, MoveOn.org, Common Cause, Policy Link, SourceWap, a number of these organizations began to mobilize, and I guess, Julie, you were part of that mobilization, to begin to expose some of this organization and the way it was operating. There is a group actually that came out of cows here in Wisconsin called Alice, and there's a coalition now. Alice was an attempt to counter Alec, and I think it's called the State Progressive Network or something, are now coming together along with another group to form a group called SIX, S-I-X, which is the State Innovation Exchange, right? The X is for exchange, right? And that now is sort of the new organization that is going to attempt to prepare model laws from a progressive standpoint, and they've created a kind of library where people can access these various laws and sort of alerts when certain state legislators are pushing through certain bills and so on, so that people can begin to get access to this information in a timely manner so that they can do something about it and begin to contact their legislators and so on. It's an interesting, the problem with these counter networks, it remains to be seen whether they're going to be sort of ad hoc, in response to, or whether they can actually create some system of sustainability. The strength of ALEC, of course, is that it's membership driven, so it has an ongoing stream of revenue that sustains it over time. It remains to be seen how these groups manage to sustain themselves and what kind of revenue they're able to acquire. They may end up being, because they don't want to take corporate money, they may end up being more dependent on foundation, wealthy individuals and so forth, or people like us who go to their website and donate money, which isn't a bad idea. We'll see whether they can have the same kind of influence as Alec and the state policy networks. Next. We basically analyzed these model bills. I think there were about 54 that were focused on K-12 education. There's another bunch that are on higher ed that we didn't look at. And we also did content analysis of all of their other publications and so forth. And again, thanks, Julie, for your work with those model bills and making those available. Next. Content analysis, you all know this kind of stuff. Saldana's work on coding, which if you're familiar with it, it's kind of a cool book. So what were the major themes of the model bills in the Education Task Force? There were primarily four, grouped under these areas. Privatization of public assets, meaning not only in education, but we see that in the military with the privatization of the military, contracting out Social Security, healthcare. In every area, there's an attempt to contract out, privatize. And this is partly, sometimes when we talk about neoliberalism, we don't understand that there's kind of what some are calling roll back neoliberalism and roll out neoliberalism. And the difference is in the role of the state. In the roll-back neoliberalisms, that's sort of your classic Milton Friedman, shrink the state. The state should only be involved in a minimal set of things, and that's the sort of official discourse of a lot of these libertarian think tanks, right? And the reason they were so upset with George Bush is because he actually grew the state, right? But what's happening on the ground, not in theory, but on the ground, is that the state isn't really shrinking, but its role is changing. So the state now, its role is to, where markets don't exist, promote those markets, right? So it becomes a kind of conduit for creating the conditions for privatization and contracting out and so forth, with the idea of saving money, right? So how is the University of Wisconsin going to absorb the $300 million cut, that you're about to have? You're probably going to see a lot of contracting out of services, right, to save money. Opening up markets, profit seeking. So profit seeking was an aspect of this, not the whole thing, because a lot of these are driven by ideology, not only by profit, but since Alec has the corporations involved, you see a much greater level of profit-seeking motivation here. Education is a $1 trillion market that can be opened up and is increasingly being exploited. Next. This is just an example of one of the Alec bills. Next. Third is dismantling teachers' unions' tenure and the promotion of alternative certification. There are a number of bills that relate to these issues. Bills promoting conservative social and moral values were actually not that present. Alec is not so much a neoconservative organization concerned with social values as it is a neoliberal organization concerned with markets and privatization and anti-union and those kinds of issues. And Alec got its fingers burnt when it opened up that task force that created the Stand Your Ground laws and the voter ID laws. And so I think that they are very cautious now about getting groups like the National Rifle Association and the groups that are around more sort of neoconservative social issues. So you saw a few of these. I'm trying to remember the bills in education. I expected to see more around things like evolution and stuff like that, and I really didn't see any of that. I don't recall what specific areas. I don't know, Julie, if you remember, but Was it?
There's a category of very specific curriculum materials. So if you're categorizing types of bills, I would include the category of very specific curriculum materials.
Right.
And then
Curriculum and curriculum materials.
And then parent, so you've got the, not only the choice, but the parent trigger laws, and then the parent objection to curriculum materials. So providing parent choice within the classroom.
To opt out of almost
To
anything.
opt out for
Right.
any unknown reason.
Right. I just used Alec's parent trigger act in my ed policy class the other night and had them analyze it. It was fascinating. Yeah. The political strategies. Some are fairly obvious, the use of policy networks. That's both a modality and a political strategy. Bringing together a partnership of corporations and legislators, obviously. Focus on state level legislation, but networked to the federal level, so these levels work in collaboration. An appeal to multiple constituencies, operating under the radar, a shotgun approach to model bills. This means that what Alec will often do is they will send a whole bunch of bills through the legislature around a particular topic. One of them, example, is that they're scholarship bills. Scholarship is the term they use instead of vouchers, because voucher is sort of a tainted term. So there's like scholarships for, really vouchers for foster children, scholarships for kids of military families, scholarships for the kids, like all these bills are going through essentially around the same thing. And of course the Parent Trigger Act is really a very fancy sort of democratic looking parent empowerment cover for converting schools to vouchers and so on. And so they'll send all these through, hoping that maybe one will catch on and they'll get vouchers for the foster kids. It's kind of like what they did with No Child Left Behind, where they got the vouchers for the tutoring services, right? So they at least get something. Or they'll send some big bill through that looks like it's going to totally privatize the system, which Erica was saying was one that went through recently here in Wisconsin.
Or being debated.
Pardon?
Being debated.
Or being debated, and then kind of back off and say, well, we really didn't want this whole thing, we just wanted this piece here, but we asked for this, which is kind of an old political strategy. Secure member dues-based resource stream is, I think, another political strategy that's very successful for them. Go on. Discursive strategies. It was really interesting to watch how they are using language, what language they consider sort of toxic, that won't play, versus language that, like the vouchers versus scholarship kind of idea. We saw a lot of discursive tensions or hybrid discourses that would mix sort of liberal and neoliberal kinds of language together. To sort of appeal to those legislators that might be sort of on the fence or might find certain bills too conservative. Parent trigger is a good example. Parent empowerment kind of language, but then vouchers. Appropriates and reinforces the new neoliberal common sense that access deep frames. So they're very savvy about. If you've read George Lakoff's work about deep frames and surface frames and so forth, about playing on people's deep frames, right? They're sort of that non-rational part of our reaction to something that we sort of say, oh yeah, that sounds good, that sounds right. Yeah, we should give parents the right to choose. That deep frame sort of stuff. Or what's his name, Kahneman calls fast thinking versus slow thinking, similar kind of idea. Okay, I need to wrap up. I talked about this. What I wanted to talk a little bit about is research also being privatized? Is academic research being privatized? So that's another kind of issue that I'm kind of interested in as well. But I think given that we're pretty much out of time, I'm going to wrap up here, and we can just, based on this, I'm going to open it up for questions. Maybe the very last, maybe that very last slide, because I wanted to, there's a quote I have in here, one more. Yeah, we'll end with Milton Friedman, how's that? his famous quote, and this is the whole point of think tanks and groups like this: to keep options open until circumstances make change necessary. There is enormous inertia, a tyranny of the status quo in private and especially government arrangements. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And what these think tanks, whether it's the State Policy Network or Alec, are doing very effectively is they're creating the ideas that are laying around so that as a crisis hits, and people are, I had this debate with Pedro Nogueira, one of my colleagues. He says, oh, the DOE is just grabbing ideas out of thin air. They don't know what they need. And I say, yeah, but those ideas are laying there intentionally, right? Somebody put them there. And so as people are grabbing them, they're grabbing ideas that somebody has made available to be grabbed. And I think that in some sense, as researchers ourselves, we need to take that challenge more seriously and make sure that some of those ideas laying around are our ideas. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes for some questions or comments, and then if people have further questions and comments, I know some people need to leave at 1:30, then we can have some, Gary will be up in front.
Julie.
If you, your political slide, I think is a political strategy slide is an important one. And I think that maybe I would use some different terminology and focus on 3 different political strategies that I've seen. One is the kind of take their money or follow the money notion. That's the notion of taking corporations and being able to use their money to put pieces into the public domain. Another, just quickly, another is the notion of your shotgun approach. Actually, in one of the early education documents, is it 85? In 1985 education document, Alec refers to that as their whack-a-mole strategy. We didn't actually say that. I mean, that it is a quotation from a 1985 document. And so, there, if I can remember the paragraph, it's something about dump as much in as you can, because the teachers union won't be able to fight it all. Right. They're going to go from issue to issue, and 1 or 2 will make its way through. So it's a whack-a-mole strategy, right. And I think that actually using their own language and the visual image of whack-a-mole is really very useful. And then another strategy that they've been very clear about, and I can't give you a quote from it, is a divide and conquer strategy. So those 3 pieces I don't quite see up there, except your shotgun, there's a difference between shotgun approach and whack-a-mole, and theirs is clearly whack-a-mole.
And what was the third one again?
Take the money, divide and conquer, whack-a-mole.
Divide and conquer.
Well, and the divide and conquer, I think, relates to what you had earlier with the derision.
Oh.
So you saw that very clearly here, with our protests 3 years ago and the demonization of teachers. We're now lazy professors, so we all just need to teach a little more.
You're the establishment, education establishment.
Yeah, that's so I think that in addition to a discursive strategy, that's an overt political strategy, I think, in terms of the divide and conquer.
Yeah, and there's a lot of blurring between the discursive and the political strategies. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How do you think of this in terms of collective action? So if you have a political entrepreneur, and that political entrepreneur used to be a human being, but now you have a political entrepreneur that is a corporation, and that corporation exists to make a profit, and so the political actions that they take are aligned with their reason for existence. As far as counteracting that, you're talking about these things that are coming up ad hoc right now. What sorts of organizations exist on their own that could battle something like this long term? It seems like there's a fundamental asymmetry there. A bunch of people who are professors, that's a very different thing. It's not like you have a bunch of conservative professors that push this. how do you think about that collective action? Because it's a different kind of entity. Like,
Right. Well, traditionally, those organizations were unions and professional associations. So if we go beyond what the reason it's called new governance is because the political actors 30, 40 years ago that were having a lot of influence were teachers. If you go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, the business community actually was highly influential in the early 20th century. We've all read the historical accounts by Callahan and so forth, right? Then they were kind of out of the picture for a while. And it was really with the 1980s pretty much that the business community came back in. I'm sure you heard about the Powell memo and all that kind of history of the business community coming back in. So, but before that, the unions and the professional associations were fairly influential in the state legislatures. The American Association of Superintendents or American Association of School Administrators and, the AERA and all these organizations did have a considerable amount of influence, and there weren't as many counter networks to the unions, right? You could put the shoe on the other foot in a way. These organizations have become much more powerful. And that's why they're so anti-labor, right? They want to get, we all have our issues with unions, on the ground and all that. But as a countervailing force, the unions really have traditionally been, in the mid-'70s when wages flatlined and profits productivity continued to rise, that was partly correlated with the drop in unionism, right? So the question is, what's the countervailing force now that's organized and not ad hoc? And that's a very good question. And the reason I think higher ed, I'm going out on a limb here, but I think one of the reasons that higher ed has been so much more bashed by a lot of these, and K-12 has sort of managed to sort of deflect a lot of it, is because of the teachers' unions that have, had that kind of organized power. But this is the question: is can these new groups, how can they create an organized countervailing force to these groups? And that's a question globally, because these forces are global, and sharing information. And there's all this policy transfer going on. A lot of what we saw in New York City came from Britain. What's his name? Steve Barber. A lot of those British folks under Thatcher. Yeah.
Hi, Gary. It's so nice to have you here. Thanks so much for your talk. So I have a question. When we talk about new policy networks, I think
I'm going to set back so you can project.
Yeah. I think when we talk about new policy networks, we often talk about them as if ideas, money, people kind of flow freely between institutions and between different scales. We get this kind of bird's eye view, right, of the network. But I fear what we don't understand are like the kind of the contestations, the disjunctures, the kind of frictions that actually constitute these networks on a material and kind of level of social relations. And I think in part that's part of what we need to understand in order to begin dismantling them, right? Or approaching them. And so I guess from a researcher perspective, what are the research challenges to understanding these networks and the power? In order to start understanding the next layer down of how these networks are actually constituted.
Yeah. One of the things that's hard to do, and we've talked about getting a grant to do interviews with policy actors and things like that, because one of the things that's missing here, this is basically kind of content analysis. It doesn't have an interview component. But one of the things that happens behind the scenes, like getting access to the conversations and these debates that are going on among these folks are typically going on in spaces we don't have access to. So even if we were going to do research on them, it's a problem of access. Right. Now, some investigative journalists have actually, I've read a really good account of New Jersey, where they not only did the content analysis of bills, but they were able to talk to people in Christie's office who were able to talk about how, because Alec also has a whole staff of people who will work with you to help you strategize and get your bills through. And so you have all these telephone conversations going on between people, say in Christie's office trying to get their own, use Alec to get their own bills through and so forth. And these folks in Alec are on the phone with these people, helping them strategize and so on. So there's all this stuff going on behind the scenes, the sort of micropolitics of all of this, that's very hard to get any access to. And that's where a lot of this kind of contention and so forth takes place. But they have seemed to be able, in spite of all of that, to present a more or less, united front. And some of that, I think, comes from the fact that some of these groups, like the State Policy Network and Atlas and Liberty Network, and some of those are intentional networks. I mean, the State Policy Network has an office in Washington, D.C. that coordinates all of the local networks and provides resources and helps them coordinate and so forth. So there's a certain level of intentionality in these networks that I think then helps sort of guide the process. So they're not sort of ad hoc here and there, although I'm sure there's lots of dissension and disagreement, particularly ideological disagreements between, say, libertarians and neoconservatives and liberals. You also, Michael Apple's analysis of the sort of New Right Coalition, which includes people like us who support things like high-stakes testing and these various kinds of policies, in part because they really work for our children, right? I mean, our children do well on standardized tests. So there's a whole group of liberals who are part of these coalitions who really have a certain self-interest in not contesting some of these policies, particularly the ones that are more around, high-stakes testing and that sort of new public management kind of managerialist kinds of schemes, consultancies, and so forth. So it's a weird alliance of groups that are not natural bedfellows necessarily, but find common ground on a lot of these issues.
Just to follow your comments, Alec, because of their nonprofit status, they have to let people come into their conferences. And one of our state assembly women has gone to the Alec.
Oh, is this Chris Larson?
No, Chris Taylor.
Oh, Chris Taylor.
Yeah, Chris Taylor. And it's expensive. I think it's like $2,000 to get in, something, her total expense is about a couple $1,000s. So if anybody really wants to infiltrate and really check them out and see where their Achilles heels are.
But you're only allowed into certain things.
That's okay.
Like the task force meetings, I think you're not allowed in.
You hang out in the bathrooms. All the work is done in the bathrooms.
But you've got to get your IRB board to allow you to take the microphone in there and
No,
get it on
that's
tape.
okay. If you got things like this, it works.
So last question and then.
So one of your slides touched on how to inject research into legislative action. Do you have any models for that? I mean, suppose WCR wanted to get more engaged with the legislative process here in the state.
Yeah.
In the spirit of injecting research, not in the spirit of a political advocacy.
Right.
Do you have models for how that's working?
Yeah. Well, I think this is a really interesting question. How can we become more aggressive in our promotion of our work to state legislators? And I think we don't want to necessarily become think tanks or engage necessarily in the same set of strategies that, there's people who will make that argument that we need to be more like think tanks. But one thing that think tanks do well, there are some things we can learn from them. For example, they do create packages for journalists, for example. Journalists work on deadlines. It's Wednesday, I got to have this in by Friday. The American Enterprise Institute has photos and a story and everything prepared just for me. I can pull that off the web and send it in, right? So I think that as academics, we aren't trained to do that kind of thing or think about the multiple audiences for our work. Some of us are starting to blog, which is interesting, but the idea that policymakers are one audience, but parents. Julie was telling me that she had a piece in the school board journal that went viral among parent groups, right? So there are school board groups. So there are lots of different audiences out there, and if you remember the old Carol Weiss argument about the Enlightenment function of research and how we actually impact policy isn't directly through our legislators, but through getting our ideas out there, kind of like this Milton Friedman model. You know, to the extent that we get those ideas out there broadly and begin to influence how people think about things, that's another way that we can effectively, I think, have some influence. But I think we can also be more strategic in targeting policymakers with our work, creating websites that are more, you know, I was on the council of AERA recently, and I kept telling Felice Levine, you know, you go into our AERA website, and a journalist is going to go in there and say, oh, this is here's the conference, and there's nothing in there for me, right? But you go into the American Enterprise Institute website, and it looks very inviting, and it's like, oh, there's all this good stuff I can find. So somehow we need to sort of, I hate to use the word like rebrand or something, somehow we need to be more savvy about how we become more inviting to journalists and other groups that can take our work. And you know, universities now have people assigned to do that, right? I mean, I'm sure, Julie, you must have somebody who makes sure that when somebody publishes an article that they get it into the media or something. I don't know. No? I think anyway, you would probably have a dozen of them. Seems like nowadays it's more important if you're in the New York Times than if you're in an academic journal. But you know, that's not all bad. You know, I mean, we need to get our work out there in ways that, I mean, I was saying to somebody, I've been looking at this Rio Grande Institute in New Mexico. The Rio Grande Institute is part of that network. One guy, his name is Paul Gessing, and Al Pope in North Carolina, somebody was saying, one person spends his entire job is to place op-eds in the newspapers that give a drumbeat of these very kinds of issues. And those people up in Eau Claire and Ashland and those places, they read their local paper, and they read their op-eds, and they read the letters to the editor, and they form their opinions by those things. And you know, that's another audience that we need to get our work out to.
Thank you very much, Gary.